Hello everyone, welcome back to Buried Files. Tonight we bring you 6 deeply disturbing true Appalachian deep woods horror stories that will make you question what really lurks in America's most ancient and mysterious mountain forests. These are not fictional tales, but real encounters shared by people who ventured too deep into places where modern civilization has never truly taken hold. Each story has been carefully researched and verified through witness testimonials and supporting evidence. The mountains of Appalachia hold secrets that most people will never understand. And perhaps that is for the best. If you enjoy authentic horror content that will keep you awake at night, subscribe to Buried Files and hit the notification bell so you never miss our latest investigations into the unknown. After you listen to these chilling accounts, we want to hear from you in the comments below about your own encounters with the unexplained. Now settle in as we explore the darkness that dwells in the deep woods. I have been bow hunting the Cherokee National Forest for 15 years. I know these ridges like the back of my weathered hands. I can tell you which hollows hold the biggest bucks, which creek beds run dry by August, and which stands of oak produce the sweetest acorns that draw deer from miles around. But what happened during the 2019 season made me hang up my bow for good. It started with the feeling of being watched. My name is Marcus Thompson, and I am 43 years old. I have lived in East Tennessee my entire life, raised on these mountains by a grandfather who taught me that the forest provides for those who respect it. I learned to read signs in the dirt, to move silent as smoke through the underbrush, and to understand the language that animals speak with their movement and behavior. I thought I understood these mountains completely. I was wrong. October 15th, 2019, opening day of archery season. I had been scouting a particular ridge since late August, watching a massive 10-point buck that would wander down to drink from a spring-fed creek every morning around 7:30. This deer was easily the largest I had ever seen in these parts, with a rack that would make any hunter proud. I had my stand positioned perfectly, downwind about 30 yards from his drinking spot, hidden in a cluster of mature white oaks that blocked my silhouette from below. I arrived at my hunting spot 3 hours before dawn, as is my custom. The walk from my truck took about 40 minutes through terrain that would challenge most people. But I could navigate these deer trails blindfolded. The morning was crisp, probably around 38 degrees, with a light frost that would burn off once the sun cleared the ridgeline. Perfect hunting weather. The kind of morning that makes you grateful to be alive and in the woods. I settled into my tree stand and began the patient wait that every bow hunter knows well. This is meditation time, when you become part of the forest ecosystem. Your breathing slows, your senses sharpen, and you start to notice things that hurried people miss entirely. The way squirrels communicate danger through specific chatter patterns. How birds go silent when predators move through their territory. The subtle changes in wind direction that carry scent in unexpected ways. But something felt different that morning. I had hunted this exact spot 6 times during my pre-season scouting, and the forest had always welcomed me with familiar sounds and rhythms. This time, there was an underlying tension that I could not identify. The squirrels were quiet. Too quiet. Even the ever-present chatter of chipmunks seemed muted and nervous. I attributed it to opening day jitters and tried to focus on watching for my target buck. 7:20 came and went with no sign of the deer. This was unusual, but not alarming. Wildlife patterns can shift for dozens of reasons, from changes in food sources to pressure from other hunters in adjacent areas. I decided to wait until 10 o'clock before climbing down and checking the area for fresh sign. That was when I first felt the eyes on me. Every hunter knows this sensation. It is primal and unmistakable. Something was watching me with focused intensity. I slowly scanned the forest around my position, moving only my eyes at first, then gradually turning my head to check different angles. Nothing visible. But the feeling persisted and grew stronger. I spent the next 2 hours in a state of heightened alert, constantly scanning the woods while trying to maintain focus on my hunting area. The sensation of being observed never faded. It was like having someone stare at you from across a crowded room. Except I was alone in thousands of acres of wilderness. Or at least, I thought I was alone. Around 9:30, I caught movement in my peripheral vision. Something large had shifted position about 60 yards to my left, behind a thick stand of mountain laurel. I watched that spot for 10 minutes without seeing anything else. But I knew something was there. The feeling of being watched had intensified, and now it seemed to have a specific direction and source. I decided to investigate. I climbed down from my stand as quietly as possible and moved toward the laurel thicket where I had seen the movement. My bow was nocked and ready, though I had no intention of shooting at an unidentified target. Safety rules are never optional, regardless of how curious or unsettled you might feel. As I approached the area, I found sign that made my blood run cold. Footprints, human footprints, but not the boot prints you would expect from another hunter. These were bare feet, and they were enormous. At least size 15, maybe larger, with unusually long toes and what appeared to be thick calluses on the soles and sides. The prints formed a clear trail that led from the laurel thicket to a position that would have given whoever made them a perfect view of my tree stand. They had been watching me, studying me. For how long, I had no way of knowing. I followed the trail for about 100 yards, becoming increasingly disturbed by what I found. The prints showed someone who moved with complete silence and confidence through terrain that would challenge experienced hunters. Whoever had made these tracks knew exactly where to step to avoid breaking branches or disturbing loose rocks. They had positioned themselves to observe me while remaining completely hidden. The trail led to a natural rock outcropping that provided an elevated view of the entire valley where I had been hunting. From this position, someone could watch multiple hunting areas simultaneously and track the movement of anyone entering or leaving the forest. It was a surveillance point, and it had been used recently and extensively. I found evidence of a long-term presence. Fire rings that had been carefully constructed to produce minimal smoke. Crude shelters built from deadfall and natural materials. Food caches hidden in rock crevices and hollow logs. Someone had been living in these mountains, and they had been watching hunters and other visitors for an extended period. But the most disturbing discovery came when I found what appeared to be a journal, wrapped in deer hide and wedged into a crack in the rocks. The pages were filled with observations written in a crude but legible hand. Descriptions of hunters, hikers, and campers who had passed through the area over what must have been several months. Details about their equipment, their routes, their habits, and their schedules. My name was in that journal. Multiple entries describing my scouting trips, my hunting patterns, and even specific details about my equipment and clothing. Someone had been documenting my presence in these mountains with the thoroughness of a scientific researcher. But the tone of the entries was not scientific. It was possessive and increasingly hostile. The final entry, dated just 2 days before opening day, contained a message that made me understand how much danger I was in. It read, "Thompson comes too often. Thinks he owns this ridge. Time to teach him about respect. Time to show him who really lives here." I was was being hunted. I left that outcropping as quickly and quietly as possible, but I knew my situation had fundamentally changed. Someone was living wild in these mountains. Someone who considered my presence an intrusion that required correction. I had stumbled into a territorial dispute with something that was no longer entirely human. The walk back to my tree stand felt like the longest 40 minutes of my life. Every shadow could conceal an ambush. Every sound could signal an approaching threat. I had gone from being a predator to being prey, and the role reversal was psychologically devastating. When I reached my hunting area, I found that my tree stand had been disturbed. Someone had climbed up and gone through my gear. My thermos was open, my calls were scattered, and my scent eliminator had been poured out on the ground. It was a message, clear and unmistakable. I was not welcome here. But the real message was waiting at my truck. All 4 tires had been slashed with what appeared to be a large knife or machete. The cuts were clean and deliberate, designed to strand me in the mountains rather than simply disable my vehicle. Someone wanted me to understand that leaving would not be simple or easy. I used my cell phone to call for help, but I had no signal. The mountains in this area are notorious for poor cellular coverage, and I was effectively cut off from the outside world. I was stranded, being hunted by someone who knew these mountains better than I did, and night would be falling in less than 6 hours. I made the decision to hike out on foot rather than spend the night in my truck. The walk to the nearest road was approximately 8 miles through difficult terrain, but it seemed safer than remaining stationary and vulnerable. I packed my essential gear and began what I knew would be a challenging trek. The hike became a nightmare within the first hour. I was being stalked. I could hear movement in the forest around me, always just out of sight, but clearly shadowing my route. Branches would snap in the distance. Rocks would clatter down slopes when no wind was blowing. And always, that sensation of being watched by hostile eyes. 3 times I stopped and called out, identifying myself as a hunter and asking whoever was following me to show themselves. The responses chilled my soul. Not words, but sounds. Guttural vocalizations that seemed half human and half animal. Calls that spoke of rage and territorial aggression and something that had moved beyond normal human behavior. By the 4th mile, I realized that my stalker was not trying to remain hidden anymore. He wanted me to know he was there. He wanted me to be afraid. The psychological pressure was constant and building towards something that I did not want to experience. I began finding signs that he was moving ahead of me, positioning himself along my route. Fresh footprints crossing the trail I was following. Broken branches that had been snapped within the last few minutes. The unmistakable evidence that someone was setting up an ambush. Mile 6 brought the first direct contact. A rock, easily 5 pounds, came crashing through the trees and struck a pine trunk less than 3 feet from my head. The impact was so violent that bark exploded in all directions, and the sound echoed through the valley like a gunshot. There was no mistaking this for an accident or natural occurrence. Someone had thrown that rock with enough force to kill me if their aim had been better. I started running. The final 2 miles became a desperate flight through terrain that I knew could break an ankle or worse if I made a wrong step. But staying still meant facing whatever had been stalking me through the mountains. And I had no illusions about my chances in that confrontation. My bow would be useless at close range, and I was dealing with someone who had been living wild long enough to become something other than a normal human being. The sounds of pursuit followed me all the way to the road. Crashing through underbrush, inhuman vocalizations, and the constant sense of something large and aggressive closing the distance between us. I have never been more grateful to see asphalt and civilization than I was that evening when I finally stumbled out of the forest. A passing motorist stopped and gave me a ride to town, where I reported the incident to the local sheriff's department. They were polite, but clearly skeptical of my story. Vandalism and petty theft are common problems in areas with heavy hunting traffic, and they seemed to think I had encountered nothing more than local troublemakers trying to discourage competition. But I knew what I had experienced, and I knew it was far more dangerous than simple vandalism. I never went back to retrieve my truck or my tree stand. I wrote them off as a complete loss and considered it cheap tuition for a lesson that probably saved my life. The Cherokee National Forest is home to more than bears and deer. Something lives in those deep hollows and remote ridges that has chosen to remain hidden from modern civilization. Something that considers the mountains its exclusive territory and will defend that territory with lethal force. I sold my hunting equipment and have not returned to those mountains since 2019. I tell people that I lost interest in hunting, but the truth is that I learned I was never the apex predator I thought I was. Something else holds that position in the deep woods of Appalachia, and it does not welcome visitors or competition. Sometimes, late at night, I still feel those eyes watching me. I know it is just psychological aftermath from a traumatic experience, but the sensation is real and unsettling. I have trouble sleeping when the moon is full, and I find myself checking locks and looking out windows at shadows that probably contain nothing more dangerous than neighborhood cats. But probably is not the same as certainly. And I learned in those mountains that the impossible and the deadly can be the same thing. I am sharing this story not for attention or sympathy, but as a warning. The Cherokee National Forest, like many wilderness areas in Appalachia, contains things that do not appear on any official map or wildlife survey. If you hunt or hike in these mountains, understand that you are entering territory that belongs to something else. Something that has been there longer than our civilization and has no intention of yielding that territory to weekend visitors. Pay attention to the signs. Trust your instincts. And if you ever find yourself being watched by something that feels wrong and dangerous, do not investigate. Do not try to prove how brave or skilled you are. Leave immediately and do not return. Some lessons are too expensive to learn through personal experience, and some territories are not worth fighting over. The mountains will always be there, but you might not be if you push too hard into places where you are not welcome. That is the truth I learned in October 2019, and it is a truth that changed my relationship with the wilderness forever. I thought I understood these mountains, but they taught me that understanding and survival are not always the same thing. I was documenting abandoned settlements in the Monongahela National Forest for my graduate thesis in Appalachian Studies. The cabin I found on October 13th was not on any historical record, yet it contained fresh supplies and recent activity from the 1920s. What I experienced there has made me question everything I thought I understood about time, reality, and the nature of existence itself. I need to tell someone this story before I lose my mind completely. My name is Ashley Rivera, and I am 26 years old. I was pursuing my master's degree in Appalachian Studies at West Virginia University when this happened. My thesis focused on the settlement patterns of early 20th century homesteaders in remote areas of the Monongahela, specifically examining how isolated communities developed unique cultural practices and survival strategies. I had spent 8 months researching historical documents, land surveys, and oral histories, building a comprehensive database of forgotten settlements that once dotted these mountains. My advisor, Dr. Elizabeth Hartman, had encouraged me to pursue fieldwork as part of my research methodology. She believed that physically visiting these historical sites would provide insights that could not be gained through academic sources alone. I agreed with this approach and had already successfully located and documented 12 abandoned homesteads using a combination of old property maps, geological surveys, and GPS coordinates derived from historical land grants. The 13th site should have been routine. According to a 1919 property deed I had discovered in the Tucker County Courthouse, a family named Brennan had established a homestead on 40 acres of what was then private land, approximately 6 miles southeast of Parsons. The deed indicated they had built a cabin, cleared several acres for farming, and maintained the property for at least 5 years before apparently abandoning it sometime in the mid-1920s. Federal land acquisition records from 1933 showed that the property had been incorporated into the newly established Monongahela National Forest, but there was no mention of any structures being removed or demolished. This suggested that the cabin might still be standing, which would make it an invaluable research site for understanding how these isolated families had lived and worked. I planned a 3-day solo camping trip to locate and document the Brennan homestead. My equipment included professional camera gear, measuring tools, soil sampling supplies, and metal detection equipment for finding buried artifacts. I also carried detailed topographical maps, GPS units, and enough food and camping supplies to sustain me for up to a week if weather or other circumstances extended my stay. The hike to the approximate location of the homestead took most of the first day. The terrain was challenging, with steep ridges and dense undergrowth that had reclaimed what might once have been crude logging roads. I was following compass bearings based on the original property survey, adjusting for magnetic declination and trying to account for nearly a century of landscape changes. By late afternoon on October 13th, I had reached the general area where the cabin should have been located. According to my calculations, I was within a quarter-mile radius of the original homestead site. But I had not yet found any evidence of human habitation. No foundation stones, no cleared areas, no fruit trees or other indicators that a family had once lived and worked this land. I decided to establish my base camp and conduct a systematic search pattern the following morning. I found a relatively flat area near a small creek and set up my tent as the sun was beginning to set behind the western ridges. The forest around my campsite was typical of this elevation and latitude. Mature hardwoods mixed with pine, thick undergrowth of rhododendron and mountain laurel, and the kind of deep wilderness silence that city people find either peaceful or unsettling. I fell asleep easily that first night, tired from the long hike and confident that I would locate the Brennan cabin sometime the next day. My research methodology was thorough, and I had successfully found every other site I had sought. There was no reason to think this search would be any different. I was wrong in ways that I am still trying to understand. I woke up the next morning to the smell of wood smoke. This was immediately alarming because I had not built a fire the previous evening, preferring to eat cold food and avoid the risk of wildfire in an area where I might not be able to get help quickly if something went wrong. Yet the smell was unmistakable, and it was close. Very close. I unzipped my tent and looked around the campsite. No visible fire, no smoke. But the smell was stronger outside than it had been inside my tent. It was the specific scent of hardwood burning in a well-maintained fireplace or wood stove, not the acrid smell of a forest fire or carelessly managed campfire. I dressed quickly and began following my nose toward the source of the smoke. The scent trail led me southeast, up a gentle slope through a stand of mature oak trees that I had not explored the previous day. After about 10 minutes of walking, I saw it. A log cabin that had not been there the day before. I know how that sounds. I know what the rational explanations might be. I had been tired during my initial survey. The cabin was positioned in a natural depression that concealed it from most angles. The late afternoon light had been insufficient for proper visibility. There were a dozen reasons why I might have missed seeing a structure during my preliminary reconnaissance. But I knew, with absolute certainty, that this cabin had not existed the day before. The building was in remarkable condition for something that should have been abandoned for nearly a century. The log walls were solid and well chinked. The roof appeared to be in excellent repair. The windows had glass that was clean and unbroken. Most significantly, smoke was rising from the stone chimney, indicating an active fire inside. I approached carefully, unsure whether the cabin might be occupied by squatters, hunters, or some other modern presence that could explain what I was seeing. I called out several times, identifying myself as a researcher and asking if anyone was home. No response, but the front door was standing slightly ajar, as if inviting investigation. I decided to document the exterior before attempting to enter. Using my professional camera, I shot multiple angles of the structure, paying particular attention to construction details that might help date the building. What I saw through the viewfinder made no sense. The cabin appeared to have been built using early 20th century techniques and materials. Hand-hewn logs secured with traditional joinery. Foundation stones that showed the wear patterns of decades of seasonal freeze-thaw cycles. A stone chimney constructed with the kind of skilled masonry that was common in rural Appalachian construction from the 1910s and 1920s. But everything was too well preserved, too clean, too maintained for a structure that had supposedly been abandoned for nearly 100 years. I documented everything I could from the exterior, then approached the front door. It swung open at my touch, revealing an interior that defied rational explanation. The cabin was furnished and occupied. Not recently occupied, currently occupied. The fire in the stone fireplace was burning with fresh wood. The kitchen area contained food supplies that appeared to be in current use. Clothing hung from pegs on the walls. Personal possessions were scattered around the single room in the casual way that indicates active habitation. But everything was wrong. Historically wrong. The food supplies were in packaging that I recognized from historical photographs. Glass jars with handwritten labels. Cloth sacks containing flour and sugar. Preserved meats hanging from the rafters in the traditional mountain style. The clothing was period appropriate, but appeared to be recently worn and recently cleaned. The personal possessions told the same story. A straight razor and leather strop on a wooden washstand. Kerosene lamps with clean glass chimneys and recently trimmed wicks. Books and newspapers that bore dates from 1923 and 1924, but appeared to have been read recently and handled frequently. Most disturbing of all, there were signs of current activity. Wet dishes in a wooden wash basin. Food remains on a plate that suggested someone had eaten breakfast within the last few hours. Coffee grounds in a pot that was still slightly warm to the touch. I began photographing everything, trying to document what I was seeing while simultaneously trying to understand what I was experiencing. This was not an abandoned homestead that had been preserved by unusual environmental conditions. This was not a historical recreation or a museum exhibit. This was a cabin that appeared to be actively inhabited by people who were living in the 1920s. As I worked, I became aware of sounds outside. Footsteps on the wooden porch. Voices speaking in low tones that I could not quite make out. The sounds of daily activity that suggested people were approaching the cabin with the casual familiarity of residents returning home. I moved to the window and looked out, expecting to see modern people who might explain this impossible situation. Instead, I saw two figures dressed in clothing from the 1920s, walking toward the cabin with the easy confidence of people returning to their own home. The man was wearing work clothes that I recognized from historical photographs. Canvas pants, a cotton shirt, and leather boots that showed the wear patterns of daily use. The woman was dressed in a simple cotton dress with an apron, her hair arranged in a style that was popular in the early 1920s. They were talking to each other in voices that carried clearly through the morning air, but I could not understand what they were saying. Not because they were speaking quietly, but because the language itself seemed strange. It was recognizably English, but with an accent and vocabulary that sounded archaic, like something from a much earlier time period. I realized that I was about to be discovered in their home, and I had no idea how to explain my presence or my equipment. I quickly gathered my camera and notes and moved toward the back door, hoping to retreat without being seen. But as I reached for the door handle, I heard something that made my blood run cold. The woman was calling my name, not calling to me, but talking about me. She was telling the man that Ashley was here, looking through our things again. She spoke about me as if my presence was expected, routine, something that happened regularly. I had never seen these people before in my life. I pushed through the back door and ran toward the tree line, no longer concerned with stealth or documentation. I needed distance and time to process what I had experienced. But as I reached the edge of the clearing, I heard the man call out behind me, "Ashley, you do not need to run. You always come back anyway." I kept running until I reached my campsite, then quickly broke camp and began hiking toward my vehicle. I needed to leave this area immediately and return with other people who could witness what I had found. Preferably people with expertise in paranormal phenomena or unexplained occurrences, because I was clearly dealing with something outside normal experience. But when I reached the spot where I had parked my truck, I found something that made me question my sanity completely. My vehicle was not there. In its place was a different truck, older and less familiar, but with my gear loaded in the bed exactly as I had left it. The keys in my pocket started this different truck, and the registration in the glove compartment bore my name and address. I drove back to Morgantown in a state of complete psychological confusion. Nothing made sense. My memory of events was clear and detailed, but the physical evidence suggested a reality that contradicted everything I thought I knew about my own life and experiences. When I reached my apartment, I found more impossibilities waiting for me. My research notes contained documentation of 13 abandoned homesteads, including detailed photographs and measurements of the Brennan cabin. According to my own handwriting, I had visited that site multiple times over the past several months and had maintained regular contact with the residents as part of my ongoing research. But I had no memory of any previous visits to that location. My computer contained gigabytes of photographs showing the cabin in different seasons, different weather conditions, and different states of occupancy. Some photos showed the building empty and abandoned. Others showed it actively inhabited by people whose faces I did not recognize, but who appeared completely comfortable with my presence. In several photos, I appeared alongside the residents, smiling and relaxed as if we were old friends. I was wearing clothing that I owned, but did not remember purchasing. My hair was arranged in styles that I did not remember choosing. I was living a life that I could not remember living. Over the following weeks, I tried to research what I had experienced. I consulted with professors, psychiatrists, and experts in unexplained phenomena. The theories ranged from psychological dissociation to temporal anomalies, to elaborate hoaxes designed to drive me insane. But the physical evidence was undeniable. The photographs existed. The documentation was real. According to every record I could find, I had been conducting research at the Brennan homestead for months, maintaining regular contact with residents who should have been dead for nearly a century. I tried to return to the site once more, accompanied by my thesis advisor and 2 other graduate students. We found the clearing where the cabin should have been, but it was empty. No building, no foundation stones, no evidence that anything had ever been constructed there. Dr. Hartman was concerned about my mental state and suggested that I might be experiencing some form of graduate school stress that was manifesting in elaborate fantasies. She recommended therapy and a temporary suspension of my fieldwork until I could sort out whatever psychological issues I was dealing with. But that night, alone in my apartment, I found new photographs on my camera. Images of the cabin, occupied and active, showing me having conversations with people I had never seen before. The timestamp on the photos indicated they had been taken during the exact hours when I was meeting with Dr. Hartman in her office. I was living multiple lives simultaneously, and only one of them felt real to me. I completed my thesis using the documentation I could not explain, and I graduated with highest honors for research that I could not remember conducting. My academic career was launched by work that might have been produced by someone else entirely, someone who shared my name and my life, but had experiences that I could not access. I now work as a historical researcher for the West Virginia Department of Culture and History, specializing in early 20th century settlement patterns. My colleagues consider me an expert in this field, and I have published articles based on research that I cannot recall performing. Sometimes I find notes in my own handwriting that reference interviews and site visits that I have no memory of conducting. My professional reputation is based on expertise that I apparently possess, but cannot consciously access. I have stopped trying to understand what happened to me in the Monongahela National Forest. The rational explanations are insufficient, and the irrational explanations are terrifying. I am living with the possibility that time is not linear, that reality is not singular, and that consciousness is not as unified as we assume it to be. But I continue my work because the alternative is madness. I document historical sites and write academic papers and maintain professional relationships with people who sometimes reference conversations that I cannot remember having. I am sharing this story because I need someone else to know that impossible things are possible, and that expertise can exist independently of conscious experience. Somewhere in the mountains of West Virginia, there is a cabin that exists in multiple time periods simultaneously, occupied by people who know me better than I know myself. And sometimes, late at night, I find myself planning return trips to that site, using knowledge and familiarity that I cannot explain. Part of me knows exactly how to find that cabin, how to approach the residents, and how to continue research that I have apparently been conducting for much longer than I remember. That part of me is not concerned with rational explanations or academic credibility. That part of me knows that some questions can only be answered by accepting that reality is far stranger and more complex than any of us are prepared to admit. The Brennan homestead is still there, still occupied, still waiting for my next visit. And despite everything I have experienced, I know that I will return there again, whether I remember choosing to do so or not. That is the truth I learned in the Monongahela National Forest. And it is a truth that has become the foundation of a life I cannot fully remember living. My grandfather always warned our family never to fish Blood Creek after sunset. He said our bloodline owed a debt to something that lived in those waters. I thought it was just mountain superstition until the night I discovered what happens when you ignore family warnings. What I experienced changed my understanding of debt, obligation, and the price that some families pay for their survival in these mountains. My name is Daniel Mitchell, and I am 31 years old. I was born and raised in Letcher County, Kentucky, in a hollow that has been home to my family for 6 generations. The Mitchell name goes back to the 1870s in these parts, when my great-great-grandfather Silas settled here after the Civil War with nothing but a pregnant wife and a determination to carve out a life in land that nobody else wanted. Blood Creek runs through our family property, a narrow waterway that winds down from the high ridges and eventually feeds into the Cumberland River system. It earned its name from the reddish iron deposits that color the water during certain seasons, though local folklore attributes the color to more sinister origins. The creek has always been central to our family's survival, providing water for livestock, irrigation for crops, and some of the best fishing in eastern Kentucky. But it has also been the source of our family's most persistent and troubling tradition. Every generation of Mitchell men has been taught the same warning from childhood: never fish Blood Creek after sunset, never disturb the water during the dark hours, and never, under any circumstances, ignore the debt that our family owes to whatever lives in the deep pools where the creek bends around ancient limestone formations. My grandfather, Robert Mitchell, was the keeper of our family's oral history. He knew stories that went back 5 generations, tales passed down from father to son with the solemnity of sacred obligation. According to his accounts, our family's survival in these mountains came at a price that was negotiated long before I was born. The story, as he told it, began with my great-great-grandfather Silas during his first winter on the property. The winter of 1871 was brutal, even by Appalachian standards. Snow fell early and deep, and temperatures stayed below freezing for weeks at a time. Silas and his pregnant wife Mary were facing starvation, with no neighbors close enough to provide help and no resources to get them through until spring. Desperate and facing the death of his family, Silas began fishing Blood Creek during all hours, including after dark when fishing was traditionally forbidden by local custom. The old-timers had warned him about disturbing the water after sunset, but hunger makes people ignore warnings that well-fed folk take seriously. On the night of December 21st, the winter solstice, Silas caught something that was not a fish. According to my grandfather's telling, the creature that emerged from the deep pool was ancient and hungry, something that had lived in these mountain waters since before white settlement began. It was intelligent, capable of communication, and very interested in making a bargain with the starving homesteader who had disturbed its winter rest. The deal was simple. The creature would ensure that the Mitchell family survived and prospered on this land, that our crops would grow in soil that defeated other farmers, that our livestock would thrive in conditions that killed other animals, and that we would always have enough to eat regardless of weather or economic circumstances. In return, every 3rd generation, the Mitchell family would provide an offering to maintain the agreement. Not money or possessions, but something more personal and permanent. Blood, life force, a payment that would renew the contract and ensure the creature's continued protection of our family line. My grandfather was the offering from his generation. His older brother Thomas had been selected, but Thomas died in a mining accident before the debt could be collected. This left my grandfather as the designated payment, and on his 21st birthday, he walked down to Blood Creek after midnight to honor the family obligation. He never told me exactly what happened during that encounter, but he returned changed. He was weaker physically for the rest of his life, prone to exhaustion and illness that doctors could never properly diagnose. But our family prospered in ways that seemed to defy the economic realities of rural Kentucky. Our tobacco crops yielded better than our neighbors. Our cattle stayed healthy when disease wiped out other herds. We always had enough money when others were struggling to survive. My grandfather lived to be 83, but he aged rapidly after his encounter with the creek creature. His hair went white within a year of his 21st birthday, and he developed a tremor in his hands that never went away. He spoke of feeling partially hollow, as if something essential had been removed from his body and could never be replaced. But he also spoke of the peace that came from fulfilling family obligations and ensuring the survival of future generations. The debt was paid, the contract renewed, and the Mitchell family would continue to prosper for another 3 generations. I am the 3rd generation since my grandfather's offering. I grew up knowing that my 21st birthday would bring responsibilities that I did not fully understand but could not ignore. My father, Charles Mitchell, had prepared me as best he could, explaining the family history and the nature of our obligations without going into details that might make the burden unbearable. But my grandfather died when I was 19, taking with him the specific knowledge of how the ritual was conducted and what exactly was required of the family representative. My father knew the general outline of the obligation, but lacked the precise details that had been passed down through previous generations. This left me in the position of having to honor a debt without fully understanding the terms of payment. My 21st birthday fell on September 15th, 2013. I had planned to approach the creek that night, following what little guidance my father could provide and hoping that instinct and family connection would carry me through whatever ritual was required. But life intervened in ways that seemed designed to test our family's commitment to maintaining the agreement. I had been accepted to Eastern Kentucky University and was scheduled to start classes just days after my birthday. This represented the first opportunity in 6 generations for a Mitchell to receive a college education. And my parents were adamant that I should not sacrifice that opportunity for what they had come to view as outdated superstition. They convinced me to postpone the creek ritual until Christmas break, when I would have time to properly research the family obligations and conduct whatever ceremony was required without interfering with my education. It seemed like a reasonable compromise, and I agreed to delay honoring the debt for a few months. That decision nearly destroyed our family. Within weeks of my birthday passing without payment, our luck began to change in dramatic and terrifying ways. The tobacco crop that had been our most promising in years suddenly developed a blight that wiped out 90% of our yield. Our cattle began dying from a respiratory illness that the veterinarian could not identify or treat. The well that had provided clean water for over a century ran dry without explanation. Most disturbing of all, I began experiencing dreams that were not dreams. Visions of something ancient and furious living in the deep pools of Blood Creek, something that had been patient for 21 years but was losing patience rapidly. The creature in these visions was not the benevolent protector of family folklore, but something far more dangerous and demanding. By November, I knew that I could not wait until Christmas break. The family debt was compounding with interest, and the consequences of delayed payment were escalating beyond anything our ancestors had experienced. On November 23rd, 3 days before Thanksgiving, I walked down to Blood Creek at midnight to honor the obligation that I should have fulfilled 2 months earlier. The night was cold and clear, with a full moon that turned the creek water silver, except in the deep pools where shadows gathered like living things. I brought with me the few ritual items that my grandfather had mentioned over the years. A knife that had belonged to Silas Mitchell, a leather pouch containing tobacco and salt, and a metal cup for whatever libation might be required. But I had no clear understanding of the ceremony itself, no knowledge of the words that should be spoken or the actions that should be performed. I was improvising a ritual that my family had conducted successfully for 5 generations, hoping that good intentions would compensate for poor preparation. I called out to the creek, identifying myself as Daniel Mitchell and acknowledging that I had come to honor my family's debt. For long minutes, Nothing responded except the sound of water moving over rocks and the distant calls of night birds. Then the water in the deepest pool began to move in ways that had nothing to do with current or wind. What emerged from Blood Creek was nothing like the creature of family folklore. This was not a benevolent protector that had helped our family prosper in exchange for periodic offerings. This was something ancient and alien and utterly indifferent to human welfare or survival. The creature was approximately human in size, but completely inhuman in form. Its skin was the color of old leather, covered with scales that reflected moonlight like wet stones. Its eyes were large and dark, positioned on the sides of its head like a fish, but capable of focusing forward with predatory intensity. When it spoke, its voice was the sound of water moving through deep caverns. It did not negotiate. It did not explain. It simply presented me with the terms of payment that my family had agreed to 5 generations earlier. Terms that were far more specific and demanding than anything my grandfather had ever described. The Mitchell family debt was not a simple offering of blood or life force. It was a binding contract that required the designated family member to serve as a guardian of the creek for the remainder of their natural life. To live in the water during the dark hours, to protect the creature's territory from intrusion, and to ensure that the ancient agreements with the land itself were maintained. My grandfather had not been weakened by giving up part of his life force. He had been changed by spending half of each day living underwater as something other than human. The creature explained that my delayed payment had created complications. Other families in the area had similar agreements with similar entities, and my failure to honor the Mitchell obligations on schedule had disrupted the balance of power among the various guardians of different water sources. Compensation would be required, not just the standard service obligation, but additional duties that would extend my commitment far beyond what previous generations had experienced. I tried to negotiate, to explain that I had not understood the full terms of the contract and needed time to prepare for such a dramatic change in my existence. The creature was not interested in negotiation. It had waited 21 years for payment, and it would not wait longer. But it offered me one alternative to immediate service. I could transfer the debt to another family member, someone whose life was less committed to modern obligations and who might be better suited to the requirements of guardianship. My younger brother Marcus was 19 years old, still living at home, and had always been more comfortable with the old ways than I was. The creature indicated that it would accept Marcus as payment if I could convince him to take on the obligation voluntarily. The choice was simple and horrible. Honor the debt myself and abandon my education, my plans, and my future as a normal human being. Or convince my brother to sacrifice his life for mine, condemning him to an existence that I was not willing to accept for myself. I made a choice that I will regret for the rest of my life. I told the creature that I would return the following night with my brother's consent to the transfer of obligation. It agreed to wait one more day, warning me that further delays would result in the forfeiture of our entire family line. I spent the next 24 hours convincing Marcus that he needed to honor a debt that was rightfully mine. I lied about the nature of the obligation, minimizing the personal cost and emphasizing the family tradition. I manipulated his sense of duty and his love for our parents to make him believe that accepting the guardianship was heroic rather than tragic. Marcus agreed to take on the debt because he trusted me and because he believed he was saving our family from disaster. He walked down to Blood Creek the following night with no understanding of what he was truly agreeing to do. I have not seen my brother since November 24th, 2013. Our family prospered again almost immediately after Marcus entered the creek. The blighted tobacco recovered and produced a late harvest that yielded better prices than we had ever received. The cattle recovered from their mysterious illness and multiplied rapidly. The well refilled with water that tested purer than anything in the county. But Marcus was gone, and I was responsible for his disappearance. I completed my education and found success in ways that seemed almost supernatural. Job opportunities appeared without effort. Business ventures prospered beyond reasonable expectation. I married well, built a successful career, and accumulated wealth that should have been impossible for someone from my background. All of it purchased with my brother's life and freedom. I still live on the family property, and I walk down to Blood Creek every few months to leave offerings of tobacco and salt at the edge of the deep pool where Marcus disappeared. Sometimes, on nights when the moon is full, I see movement in the water that might be my brother performing his guardian duties. But he never acknowledges my presence, and he never emerges from the creek to visit his family or check on the people whose prosperity he purchased with his sacrifice. I am sharing this story as both confession and warning. Some family debts are real, and some traditions exist for reasons that transcend superstition. But the price of honoring those obligations can be higher than any family should be asked to pay. If you come from mountain families with old traditions and persistent warnings, do not dismiss them as folklore. And if you ever find yourself in a position to transfer family obligations to someone else, remember that the cost of your freedom will be measured in someone else's life. Marcus Mitchell disappeared into Blood Creek on November 24th, 2013. And I am the reason he is gone. That debt can never be repaid, and that guilt can never be absolved. Some choices echo through generations, and some sacrifices can never be undone. I needed to get away from everything after my divorce, so I planned a week-long solo hike through the Blue Ridge Mountains. The rhododendron thickets they call Laurel Hell seemed like the perfect place to disappear. I had no idea something was already living there, something that could perfectly mimic any sound it heard. What I experienced changed my understanding of silence, solitude, and the dangerous difference between being alone and being hunted. My name is Brittany Caldwell, and I am 34 years old. I work as a nurse in Roanoke, Virginia, and I have been hiking these mountains since college. When my marriage ended after 8 years, I could not stand the silence in our empty house anymore. Every room held conversations that would never finish, arguments that had worn grooves in the floorboards, and the particular quiet that follows when someone stops trying to make things work. I planned a solo trip into a section of the Blue Ridge that I knew from trail maintenance work years earlier. The area is not officially mapped, just old logging roads that wind into dense rhododendron tunnels where the trail becomes more of a suggestion than a path. Locals call it Laurel Hell because the growth is so thick you can get lost within 50 yards of where you started. I wanted isolation. I wanted the kind of quiet that would let me hear myself think clearly for the first time in months. I packed for 4 days, told my sister June where I was going, and drove to an unmarked parking area that serves as a trailhead for people who know it exists. The first day went perfectly. Clear weather, steady hiking, and the gradual transition from maintained trail to deer paths to barely their roots through increasingly dense vegetation. By evening, I had reached a small clearing where I set up camp between 2 birch trees. Feeling proud of my navigation and grateful for the complete silence that surrounded me. That silence should have been my first warning. The woods in this area are usually full of night sounds. Owls, insects, the rustle of small animals moving through the undergrowth. But as I cooked dinner on my camp stove, I became aware that the forest around me was completely quiet. Not the peaceful quiet of a calm evening, but the tense quiet that happens when prey animals sense a predator nearby. I finished eating and was cleaning my cookware when I heard my name called from the darkness beyond my campfire. Britt. It was my ex-husband's voice, speaking with the exact tone he used when he was trying to apologize for something without actually saying he was sorry. The voice came from the woods, about 30 yards from my camp, but there was no way David could be here. He did not even know where I had gone, and he had never shown any interest in hiking during our entire marriage. I called out, asking who was there, but received no response. I told myself it was another camper playing a joke, or maybe a hunter who had somehow learned my name from overhearing my phone conversations at the trailhead. But the explanation felt thin, even as I tried to convince myself it was reasonable. I went to sleep uneasy, but the night passed without further incidents. The second day brought me deeper into the rhododendron thickets, where the vegetation forms natural tunnels and the world becomes a maze of green corridors. This is challenging hiking under the best circumstances, requiring constant attention to route finding and a willingness to backtrack when passages dead end into impenetrable walls of branches. But something was wrong with the acoustics in these thickets. Sounds were not behaving the way they should in a natural environment. I would hear a bird call from my right, and then the exact same call would repeat from my left with identical timing and pitch, as if it were an echo that had somehow changed direction. Water sounds moved without any visible stream. I would hear dripping from ahead of me, follow the sound, and then hear the same dripping pattern start up behind me in the area I had just left. The wind seemed to have seams, with gusts starting and stopping in discrete sections rather than flowing naturally through the forest. Most disturbing were the footsteps. I would hear the sound of someone walking parallel to my route, matching my pace, but staying just out of sight behind the wall of vegetation. When I stopped, the footsteps stopped. When I changed direction, they changed direction. But when I tried to approach the source of the sounds, I found nothing but empty forest. During my lunch break, I heard my own voice call out from the thicket. "We could stay here," it said, using the exact tone and inflection I had used 2 months earlier when I was trying to convince David to try marriage counseling. The voice was mine, but I was not speaking. I was sitting alone, eating a granola bar, when my own words came back to me from the woods. That was when I realized I was not dealing with other hikers or natural acoustics. Something in these thickets was learning from me, copying the sounds I made and the voices I knew, but not quite getting them right. I decided to push for higher ground, hoping to get above the densest vegetation and find my way back to more traveled areas. But the climb toward the ridge took me through even thicker rhododendron, where the branches formed a canopy so dense that it felt like hiking through a tunnel. The voice activity intensified as I climbed. I heard my sister June calling my name. Then my mother humming a song she used to sing while doing housework. Then David again, using the pet name he had called me early in our relationship, before things went wrong. None of the voices were quite right. They had the correct words and approximately the right pitch, but they lacked the natural breath patterns and subtle imperfections that make human speech sound human. It was like listening to a very sophisticated recording device that was trying to learn how to be a person. I reached a saddle between 2 hills and made camp as the sun was setting. I chose the spot because there was clear ground and good visibility in multiple directions. I did not want to spend another night surrounded by dense vegetation where something could approach without being seen. As darkness fell, the vocal activity around my camp became constant and increasingly sophisticated. The entity, whatever it was, began combining different voices to have conversations with itself. I heard my mother and my sister discussing my hiking plans. I heard David apologizing to me in words he had never actually spoken. I heard myself agreeing to things I had never agreed to. The most disturbing moment came when I heard a child crying in the woods below my campsite. Every instinct I have as a nurse and as a human being told me to investigate, to offer help to someone who sounded lost and frightened. But I had learned enough about this entity to know that the crying was just another mimicry, another attempt to manipulate me into leaving my camp and venturing into the darkness where it could approach more closely. I stayed in my tent and listened to the crying continue for over an hour, perfectly consistent in timing and pitch, never varying the way real distress would vary. It was a performance, and I was the intended audience. The third day was a race to reach the road. I abandoned my planned route and pushed directly toward the nearest service road, using compass bearings and topographic landmarks to maintain direction through terrain that seemed designed to confuse and misdirect. The entity followed me throughout the day, constantly calling my name in different voices, trying to engage me in conversation, attempting to convince me to stop and respond. But I had learned the most important rule for dealing with this phenomenon: never answer back, never give it new material to work with. By afternoon, I could hear it experimenting with combinations of sounds it had learned from me. My laugh mixed with David's voice, my mother's humming interrupted by my own cough. It was building a vocabulary of my life, collecting the audio signatures of my relationships and my emotions. When I finally reached the service road and got cell phone reception, I called my sister immediately. She answered with my name, and I almost hung up because for a split second, I could not tell if it was really her or another mimicry. That doubt, that moment of uncertainty about whether the people I love are real when they speak to me, has never completely gone away. I have not returned to that area, and I never will. I have not told many people about what I experienced because I know how it sounds. But I am sharing this story because I need people to understand that there are things in the deep woods that are curious about human beings in ways that are not benign. The entity in Laurel Hell was not trying to hurt me physically. It was trying to learn me, to understand how humans communicate and connect with each other. But its method of learning required studying me in isolation, keeping me separated from other people, while it practiced using their voices to manipulate my behavior. If you hike alone in remote areas, pay attention to sounds that feel wrong. If you hear voices calling your name in places where no one should know your name, do not answer. If you hear conversations that sound like people you know but seem slightly off, do not approach. And if you ever find yourself being followed by something that speaks with the voices of the people you love, remember that love does not sound perfect when it is real. The entity in Laurel Hell taught me that silence is not empty, and that being alone does not mean you are unobserved. Some forms of attention are predatory, and some kinds of interest are not safe to satisfy. The woods will always have their secrets, but some secrets are better left undiscovered. I inherited my great-aunt's mountain property in the Nantahala forest and found something buried beneath her cabin that made me understand why she lived alone for 60 years and never spoke about her childhood. Some family secrets should stay buried, but once you know the truth about what your ancestors did to survive, you cannot pretend ignorance anymore. What I discovered changed everything I thought I knew about my family and the price some people pay for prosperity. My name is James Patterson, and I am 38 years old. I work as a civil engineer in Asheville, North Carolina, and I thought I knew my family history until my great-aunt Mabel died at 91 and left me her property in the mountains near Robbinsville. The inheritance came as a surprise because I had only met her 3 times in my entire life. and she had never shown any particular interest in maintaining family relationships. Aunt Mabel lived alone on 40 acres of heavily wooded land that had been in our family since the 1920s. The property included a small cabin that she had built herself in the 1960s, using techniques and materials that made the structure seem much older than it actually was. She had no electricity, no running water, and no telephone. She grew her own food, hunted for meat, and traded occasionally with neighbors for supplies she could not produce herself. Most of our family considered her eccentric at best and possibly mentally ill at worst. She had never married, never held a regular job, and never explained why she chose to live in such complete isolation. The few times I had visited as a child, she had been polite but distant, treating us like strangers who happened to share her last name. When she died of a heart attack in her sleep, I was the only family member willing to deal with the property. Everyone else wanted to sell it immediately to developers who were buying mountain land for vacation homes. But something about the place drew me back, and I decided to spend a few weeks there before making any permanent decisions. The cabin was larger than it appeared from the outside, with a main room, a small kitchen, and a sleeping loft accessible by a ladder. The construction was solid and practical, built to last through mountain winters and summer storms. But there were architectural details that seemed strange for a structure built in the 1960s. The foundation was much more extensive than necessary for a cabin of this size. Stone walls extended deep into the ground, creating what appeared to be a partial basement or root cellar beneath the main structure. The floor of the cabin was raised several feet above ground level, supported by heavy timber beams that seemed designed to bear much more weight than a simple mountain cabin would require. Most peculiar was a trap door in the kitchen floor that was secured with a modern padlock, but showed evidence of much older hardware that had been removed and replaced multiple times over the decades. When I asked neighbors about the property's history, they became evasive and suggested I speak with Mabel's estate attorney about any questions regarding the land. The attorney, an elderly man named Robert Caldwell, who had known Mabel for over 30 years, was equally unhelpful. He indicated that Mabel had left specific instructions about the property, but declined to share the details until I had spent at least 2 weeks living there. She wanted me to understand the place before making any decisions about its future. I thought this was typical mountain eccentricity until I began finding things that suggested the property had a history that extended far beyond my aunt's 60 years of residence. While cleaning out a storage shed, I discovered tools and equipment that dated to the early 20th century. Hand-forged farming implements, oil lamps with glass chimneys blackened by decades of use, and wooden boxes filled with household items that looked like they belonged in a museum of Appalachian life. But more disturbing were the children's belongings mixed in with these antiques. Shoes in various sizes, clothing that had been carefully mended and remended, toys carved from wood with initials scratched into them. The quantity suggested that many children had lived on this property over an extended period of time, which contradicted everything I knew about my family history. According to our family records, my great-great-grandparents had homesteaded this land in 1923 with their 2 children, including my great-grandfather, Samuel Patterson. There had never been any mention of other children living on the property, and the isolated location made it unlikely that neighborhood children would have left belongings here. I decided to investigate the locked trapdoor in the kitchen floor. The padlock was modern, but the iron hardware around it showed signs of being much older, with layers of paint and rust that suggested it had been secured and reopened many times over the decades. Using bolt cutters, I removed the padlock and lifted the trapdoor. Below was a set of stone steps leading down into a chamber that was much larger and more complex than any root cellar I had ever seen. The underground space had been carved directly into the bedrock and reinforced with fitted stone walls. It consisted of multiple rooms connected by narrow passages, all illuminated by whatever daylight filtered down through the trapdoor opening. The construction was professional quality, requiring engineering knowledge and significant labor to complete. But the purpose of these rooms became horrifyingly clear as I explored them. The largest chamber contained the remains of primitive sleeping areas. Straw mattresses arranged in rows, with iron rings set into the stone walls at intervals that suggested restraints. A wooden bucket in one corner and a crude drainage system indicated that people had been held here for extended periods without access to proper sanitation. The walls were covered with names and dates carved into the stone. Dozens of children's names, with ages that ranged from 6 to 15, and dates spanning from the 1920s through the 1940s. Some entries included hometown information, indicating that these children had come from communities throughout western North Carolina and eastern Tennessee. In a smaller adjacent room, I found evidence of systematic record-keeping. Wooden boxes contained ledgers, written in careful handwriting, that documented the placement of children with families throughout the region. The ledgers recorded names, ages, physical descriptions, and payment amounts for what appeared to be a trafficking operation that had operated for over 20 years. The records showed that my great-great-grandparents had not been simple homesteaders struggling to survive in the mountains. They had been operating a business that involved acquiring children from desperate families or institutions and selling them to people who wanted cheap labor or had other purposes for which they were not willing to use legal adoption processes. The operation had been sophisticated and well-connected. The ledgers referenced contacts in orphanages, poorhouses, and reform schools throughout the Southeast. There were code names for buyers and detailed notes about their preferences and requirements. Most disturbing were the margin notes that tracked which children had satisfied expectations and which had required replacement. I found correspondence that made it clear this was not a small-scale operation run by desperate people. The letters discussed shipments of 20 or more children at a time, payment schedules that involved substantial amounts of money, and coordination with similar operations in other states. My family had not been poor mountain farmers. They had been successful criminals operating a business that destroyed the lives of hundreds of children over 2 decades. The final room contained evidence of what happened to children who could not be placed successfully. A collection of small personal items, shoes, clothing, toys, that had belonged to children whose names appeared in the ledgers but had no corresponding placement records. In the corner was a pile of small bones that I did not examine closely enough to identify. But that filled me with a sick certainty about the fate of children who had become liabilities to the operation. I spent 3 days documenting everything I found before I could bring myself to contact the authorities. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable, but it implicated not just my ancestors, but potentially dozens of other families throughout the region who had been customers of this trafficking network. The sheriff's department treated my report seriously, but explained that the crimes I was describing had occurred so long ago that prosecution was impossible. Most of the participants were dead, and the statute of limitations had expired decades earlier. They would investigate to determine if there were any recent crimes or ongoing activities. But the historical aspects of the case would likely be referred to academic researchers rather than criminal prosecutors. The estate attorney, Mr. Caldwell, was not surprised when I told him what I had found. He explained that Mabel had discovered the underground chambers when she built her cabin in the 1960s and had spent the rest of her life trying to decide what to do with the knowledge. She had consulted with lawyers, historians, and law enforcement over the years, but had never found a way to address the crimes without destroying the lives of innocent descendants who had no connection to the trafficking operation. Mabel had chosen to live alone on the property as a kind of guardian, ensuring that the evidence was preserved but not accessible to people who might use it to harm surviving family members of both victims and perpetrators. She had hoped that someone from our family would eventually inherit the property and find a way to honor the memory of the victims without creating new victims through exposure of historical crimes. I faced an impossible choice. I could expose everything I had found, potentially bringing some measure of justice for crimes that had been hidden for decades, but also destroying the lives of people whose only crime was being descended from criminals they had never known about. Or I could follow Mabel's example and become a guardian of terrible knowledge, protecting both the victim's memory and the innocent living. I chose a middle path. I contacted historians at Western Carolina University and arranged for the evidence to be properly documented and preserved in their archives, where it could be studied by researchers but would not be accessible to the general public without appropriate academic oversight. The physical remains were turned over to anthropologists for proper burial and memorial. I donated the property to the National Forest Service with the stipulation that it be maintained as a memorial site, though the specific nature of what is being memorialized was not made public. The underground chambers were sealed, and a small marker was placed on the site identifying it as a memorial to children who died far from home in the early 20th century. I have never spoken publicly about what I found until now, and I am only sharing this story because I believe people need to understand that historical crimes do not disappear simply because time passes. The trafficking network that operated from our family property was not unique, and similar operations existed throughout Appalachian regions during the same time period. The children whose names are carved into those stone walls deserve better than they received from the world. And they deserve better than being forgotten because their suffering is inconvenient to acknowledge. But they also deserve to have their story told without creating new victims among people who bear no responsibility for historical crimes. That is the burden I inherited along with 40 acres of mountain land. And it is a burden I will carry for the rest of my life. Some family secrets should stay buried, but others should be preserved and honored, even when the truth is too difficult for public consumption. The children who suffered and died on that property finally have a memorial, and their names have been recorded in academic archives where researchers can study their lives and deaths in the context of historical child welfare practices. It is not justice, but it is acknowledgement. And sometimes acknowledgement is the only form of justice that history allows us to provide. Every October, our small mountain community in North Georgia holds the Harvest Moon Festival, a tradition that goes back generations. Last year, I discovered that some traditions have been twisted into something far more sinister, and that our harvest celebration was feeding something ancient and hungry. What I learned cost me everything I loved about the place where I grew up, but it also saved my life. My name is Nicole Washington, and I am 29 years old. I was born and raised in Cedar Hollow, a community of about 200 people in the Chattahoochee National Forest. Our Harvest Moon Festival has always been the heart of our community life, bringing together every family for 3 days of celebration each October when the moon is full. The festival follows traditions that have been passed down for generations. We display the best crops from each farm, hold competitions for preserved foods and crafts, and gather for music and dancing that lasts until dawn. The celebration culminates with the selection of a harvest queen, a young woman who receives gifts from every family and leads the final procession that officially closes the festival. I had participated in this celebration my entire life and always viewed it as something beautiful and sacred. It made me proud of our community and confident that Cedar Hollow was a special place worth preserving. That changed last October when I was selected as Harvest Queen. The selection is made by 7 community elders who meet privately on the first night and announce their choice on the second day. I was surprised to be chosen instead of Sarah Mitchell, whose family owns the largest farm and who had been preparing for the role her entire life. But the announcement was met with genuine enthusiasm from the community. The first sign that something was wrong came when my grandmother pulled me aside after the ceremony. She was frightened, which was impossible because my grandmother had never been afraid of anything in her 78 years of mountain life. She told me that being Harvest Queen was both a great honor and a terrible responsibility, and that I needed to understand what the role truly meant. When I asked her to explain, she became evasive and said the other elders would provide the necessary information when the time was right. But she made me promise that if I ever felt uncomfortable with what was expected of me, I should come to her immediately. That evening, Elder Morrison asked me to attend a private meeting with the community leaders. He explained that there were aspects of the Harvest Queen role that could not be discussed publicly, and that I needed to be briefed on my responsibilities for the final ceremony. The meeting took place in the basement of the Methodist Church, in a room I had never seen before despite attending services there my entire life. The space was much older than the church above it, with stone walls and timber beams that looked ancient. The site's 7 elders explained that the Harvest Moon Festival served purposes beyond community celebration. The ceremony was designed to maintain an agreement that our ancestors had made with entities that controlled the prosperity of our land and the safety of our people. According to their account, the original settlers had found land that was already occupied by something that was not human, but not hostile to human presence. These entities were ancient and powerful, but willing to coexist under specific conditions that required annual tribute in the form of recognition, respect, and periodic offerings. The Harvest Queen role was central to this arrangement. The selected woman served as the community's representative in renewing the annual agreement with the entities that protected our land. This involved participating in a ceremony that was much older and more complex than the public procession. When I asked for specific details, the elders became evasive. They assured me that the ceremony was perfectly safe when conducted properly, emphasizing that my participation was voluntary, but making it clear that refusing would have serious consequences for the entire community. Elder Morrison showed me a ledger documenting harvest yields, livestock survival rates, and community health statistics for 50 years. The data showed that years when the festival was conducted properly were dramatically more prosperous than years when it was canceled or abbreviated. But I noticed something the elders did not mention. In years when the festival was conducted properly, there was always one name missing from the community roster the following year. A young woman who had served as Harvest Queen and then disappeared, with explanations about moving away to pursue opportunities in larger cities. When I asked about this pattern, they explained that serving as Harvest Queen was often transformative, inspiring women to explore horizons beyond our small community. They viewed this as natural evidence that the ceremony empowered women rather than limiting them. Their explanations felt rehearsed, and I began to suspect that the fate of former Harvest Queens was not as benign as they claimed. I asked for time to consider their proposal, and they agreed to give me until the following evening. They warned that rejecting the role would require selecting a replacement so late in the festival, which might result in a less effective ceremony than the community needed. That night, I visited my grandmother and told her everything. She listened without surprise, confirming that she had known about the true nature of the festival all along. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time. She told me she had served as Harvest Queen in 1965 and that the experience had changed her life in ways she had never been able to discuss. The mountain ceremony involved more than symbolic offerings. The entities demanded substantial tribute that could only be provided by a young woman representing the community's most precious resource. The Harvest Queens did not move away to distant cities. They were consumed by the entities during the ceremony, their life force absorbed as payment for another year of prosperity and protection. My grandmother had survived only because she had been pregnant at the time, though she had not known this when chosen. The entities had rejected her as an offering because she carried new life, making her unsuitable for their purposes. She had been returned with instructions to never speak about what she witnessed and to ensure future ceremonies were conducted properly. She had spent 60 years knowing that our community's prosperity was purchased with the lives of young women, and that she had been complicit in maintaining a system that murdered people in the name of tradition. I realized I faced a choice between becoming a victim or finding a way to expose and destroy the system, but challenging the elders directly would likely result in my death being disguised as an accident. I decided to participate in the ceremony with preparations the elders did not know about. I contacted a friend who worked for the Georgia Bureau of Investigation and arranged for law enforcement to be positioned near the ceremony site. I also left detailed documentation with my grandmother, requesting that she ensure the truth was revealed if I did not return. The mountain ceremony took place in a clearing I had never seen before. Despite growing up in these hills, the location felt wrong in ways I cannot describe, as if natural laws did not apply there. The entities that appeared were physical beings, ancient and alien, that had been living in these mountains since before human settlement. They communicated by speaking directly into minds rather than through normal hearing. The ceremony was exactly what my grandmother had described. The elders offered me as tribute to ensure another year of prosperity, and the entities prepared to accept the sacrifice that had been promised. But the law enforcement officers intervened before the ceremony could be completed. The confrontation revealed the full extent of the conspiracy that had controlled our community for over a century. 7 elders were arrested for conspiracy to commit murder. Investigations revealed evidence of dozens of previous killings dating back generations. The entities disappeared during the chaos, retreating to whatever deep places had sheltered them for millennia. Cedar Hollow was destroyed by the exposure of its darkest secret. Families moved away, rather than face the stigma of having participated in or benefited from ritualized murder. The land lost its supernatural fertility, and remaining residents struggled with crop failures that made continued habitation impractical. I survived, but lost everything I had ever known about my home. The place where I had planned to spend my entire life became uninhabitable, not because of supernatural retaliation, but because the community could not survive the truth about what it had been built on. I now live in Atlanta and work as an advocate for victims of ritualized abuse. I share my story because similar situations exist in isolated communities throughout Appalachian regions. Traditional practices that seem harmless may conceal systems of exploitation and violence that have persisted for generations. Communities that appear to be thriving may be sustained by sacrifices hidden from outsiders and rationalized by people who benefit from maintaining the status quo. The Harvest Moon Festival was not a celebration of community values. It was a murder ritual disguised as cultural tradition. If you encounter communities with secretive traditions or unexplained patterns of disappearances, trust your instincts and seek help from outside authorities. Some secrets are kept to protect people, but others are kept because exposing them would reveal ongoing crimes. Cedar Hollow is empty now, and the entities that once protected it have retreated to places where humans cannot easily follow. The mountain clearing, where generations of young women died, is overgrown with vegetation that will not support normal plant life, as if the land remembers what happened there. That is the truth I learned about my community, and it cost everything to reveal. But some truths are worth telling regardless of the price, and some traditions deserve to be destroyed rather than preserved.